I think parents need to make sure that their children are aware that what's funny is not necessarily funny.
Well, the way that my mom put it to me is, if you don't want your grandma seeing that, you better not put it on Facebook.
Well, that eliminates a lot.
And my grandma had a fly swatter, so I made sure.
Hey, this is Pastor Richard, and I'm here with Pastor Quin today, and we're going to be discussing a topic of keeping our children safe online. Now, I'll be the first one to tell you that I am not an expert in any possibility on this topic, nor am I really an expert on children. But Pastor Quin, I believe, does have a background and that can help us with this. Quin, this is the first time you've joined us on the podcast, so tell us a little bit about yourself and what makes this topic important for us as parents.
Sure. Well, I'm Quin, obviously. I'm the Children and Families Pastor here at Crossroads, and I have a background in education. I went through formal education at Mississippi State University. I have a training in kids and special needs and child psychology, and I'm certified to teach public school in 3 states from kindergarten to 12th grade. So I've had a lot of training over what kids are facing every day and how we can kind of help them out from not only a cultural standpoint, but also a scientific standpoint as well. And I think it's so important that we do this because the children today are facing problems that none of us have really faced. Matter of fact, the children born after 2013 are the first generation in history to have their entire lifetime be involved in online circles. Every other generation before them has been kind of grandfathered into online circles, but after 2013, this new generation coming up, their whole life has been online just about. And so it's really important that we establish and we think about how we can keep these kids safe as they progress and mature through their childhood.
Well, I hadn't thought about that. 2013, it kind of changed the world, if you will. I was reading an interesting statistic, and it said that 97% of Americans now own a cell phone that is internet accessible. All right, so you're talking about basically 97% of us have some method of accessing the internet, and now that number came off Google, and we all know if you read it on the internet, it must be true, right? And so we get the fact that that number may be skewed a little bit, but here's what I know. Everyone I see, it seems like, has a cell phone in their hand, and they're on it, unfortunately, even while they're driving. So when we think about this online idea, we need to understand that it's not just adults. It's one thing for an adult to make a conscious decision to have that access, but I think when we're talking about our kids, there has to be some instruction that goes with that.
Absolutely. I agree. And I think when we start talking about how we guide the kids, I think it's important that we realize that kids is a really broad term. Kid really refers to anybody under the age of 18, and we're dealing with different generational differences in there. So really today I'd like to talk a little bit about the 2 different generations that kind of fall under 18 at this time, and that's Gen Z and Gen Alpha. And so we'll start with Gen Z, and Gen Z kind of typifies that cell phone mentality that you brought up. Gen Z, they were born in the early 2000s, sometimes the late 90s, and they had a time in their life when cell phones weren't really a thing. They had a time in their life when the only cell phone was the Nokia brick phone and had no internet, a short time in their lives, but they had a little bit of time in there. So as they grew up, their whole worldview has been influenced by a rapidly changing online scene. I mean, kids that are in that Gen Z from 2000s to 2010, they've seen MySpace, they've seen Twitter, Facebook, Snapchat, Instagram, TikTok, and that's all in the span of about 7 years of all those developments. That's a lot of change to go through. And all of those changes created a need for these kids to constantly have to redefine their identity. Who am I going to be on Snapchat? Who am I going to be on Facebook? Who am I going to be on Instagram? And so I think it's kind of thrown us into a little bit of a confused state. Who are we going to be on all these online things? I mean, what do you think about that?
It's interesting that you bring back the old brick phone. I'm of the generation, obviously, where the idea of having a phone in my car never even crossed my mind. And I had a job that they put a phone in my car. Oh. And I remember the freedom, if you will, that went with that. But with the freedom came abuse.
Sure.
And I know that at the end of a couple of months, our cell phone bills, our mobile bills, they were so high.
Right.
And so there was education for us as adults that these things cost money and they had to be maintained and you had to watch what you were doing. And that was not even with access to it. But then when you mention the whole crossover of those of us that were grandfathered, phased into internet use and phone use and smartphone, I guess would be the way to word that, to this generation that's never known anything else.
Right.
I think that's an exciting idea, but it's scary. When we understand that science tells us that a child's brain's not fully formed until they're 25 years old. And I was kind of glad to hear you say that a child only encompasses 18 and under, because my wife and daughters tell me I need to grow up. So I can tell them now I'm officially a grown-up. But when we think about the idea that they're not formed,
right,
and they're still growing and they're learning, and so we have a big impact on that. Ephesians 6:4 tells us not to provoke our children to wrath, meaning not to strive to make them angry. All right. Sure. But it tells us to train them up. Well, if I'm going to train my child, I've got to spend time with my child, and I've got to know what my child's doing. And so that's a great point you bring up, that we have these different generations, and we need to be mindful of that.
Well, and I think also to kind of piggyback off of that, whenever we talk about child psychology in the school system, there are a couple of pivotal ages where the most academic education comes in. I'm not going to get into all the details there, but for example, kindergarten is one of those very critical moments in a child's academic education, because they have to learn the alphabet, they have to learn their ABCs, basic arithmetic. But then another side of their education is their cultural and social education. And we typically think of the middle school years, 6th, 7th, and 8th grade, as those pivotal years, because they are forming who they're going to be. Are they going to be a music guy, a sports guy? Are they going to be a jock? Are they going to, what are they going to do? Are they going to have blue hair, no hair? I mean, I was unfortunately stuck with the no hair option. But they have to make all these decisions about who are we. And that's already hard. I mean, I think anybody who's ever been 13, which is all of us, anybody who's ever been 13 has had to wrestle with the identity question. But now not only are kids having to wrestle with it themselves, they're having to wrestle with other people defining their identity based on what they see online.
Right.
And that's hard.
I was reading as I was preparing for this, kind of thinking through what we would discuss, that over 55% of people under 18 say that they have been cyberbullied. This whole idea, and then the other fraudulent ways that people are attacked on the internet, and so I think there is a lot to be said about them trying to develop an identity without having framework for that.
Yeah,
I read another number that said a third of 8-year-olds now have phones.
Wow,
and now again, I don't know how accurate that is.
Sure,
But I think we need to maybe think about what that looks like, and making sure that as parents, I mean, I'm a parent and a grandparent, and so I've kind of went through the cycle of my kids growing into that internet age, but my grandkids were born into that internet age, and so how do we deal with that? How do we process that?
Yeah, so let's talk a little bit about that age, the younger childhood age. So these will be kids that were born in 2010 or later. And so one of the key things about this group, like you said, they've been in technology and immersed in it their entire lives. And so I've broken down a little bit based on my experience in the schools, based on some science, based on some research. And so I just want to share a little bit about some of their needs, their wants, and their challenges. We're going to start with the challenges first. The big one, obviously, is COVID. It impacted them during a very critical developmental time, especially kids in kindergarten through like 2nd grade. It's just really tough for them. Matter of fact, right now in some schools, they're having to remediate some of the math that they lost. And typically that math is being taught 3 levels under where they're at. And that's just because they lost some momentum because of COVID. Another big challenge that they have is they're not retaining spoken word as well. They are very, very visual. People in this Gen Alpha are extremely visual. They like lights, they like flashes, they like colorful scenes on screens. And we could go all day about why that is. But at the end of the day, We just have to understand that if we want to reach this generation, we can't just talk at them. We have to show them. They are very visual. They are very monkey see, monkey do, and that's okay. We just have to make sure we're adapting our education and our teaching of them to that. I think some of us get frustrated sometimes when we have a young man or a young lady who maybe not be understanding what we're trying to say to them. And we're like, no, you don't get it. It's like this, 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 and this. And they just don't seem to get the words that we say. They're not making any sense. And it's because we need to show them. It's really, really important that we show them what they need to understand.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I guess you mean I need to put an emoji up, right? Trying to define. We are in a situation where I think we've lost, to key in on something you said, we're allowing, if we're not careful, as parents and grandparents, we can allow our kids to lose communication. We know, whether we like or dislike or what took place, it doesn't matter. What we know is during COVID that some isolation took place, and honestly, an online persona became far more important than what the person really was.
Sure.
And so as we think about that, we don't want to paint this entirely negative. There's a lot of positive stuff on the internet. There's a lot of positive things that our kids can learn. There's a lot of positive things that our kids can do there. And so we want to be careful just to not say that we're encouraging parents to go in and throw the computer in the yard, right? But what we are saying is parents, know where your kids are at, know what they're doing.
Right.
And so one of the arguments that I heard as a parent from my daughters is as they were coming into the internet age, but everyone has a cell phone, right? And that was not true back when my daughters were younger. Now today, I mean, it is a different animal.
Sure, yeah.
But what do we do with that? What do we do with? But everyone has. What do we do with? Right. But this is how I'm supposed to do my homework. I'm supposed to log in online. I'm supposed to work. So how do we do that as parents? What would be some things you would recommend and talk about there?
So one of the guiding principles I would suggest, and just keeping them safe and trying to get them, I mean, guys, we just have to face the fact the internet's a part of our life and it's always going to be a part of our life. But how do we keep them safe? And for me, the guiding principle is it's always smarter to introduce something than to moderate something. Just about always. So, for example, if I was going to introduce a baby to table food, it would not be smart to put my 1-month-old in the high chair and put a steak in front of him. That would not be a good idea. It would be better to introduce foods of progressing difficulty as they grow. Because once you do that, if you give them steak when they're a month old and they develop a taste for steak, it's going to be really hard to go back and give them baby food to get them ready for the steak because you've already given them more than they could really handle. I think it's the same with our kids. The whole idea of, but I want everybody else has. Okay, well, let's talk about it. Let's move towards that. But it's much easier to give a kid a phone with restricted access and then in 2 years give them a phone with less restrictions, and then in 2 years give them a phone with less restrictions, than to give them a fully fledged iPhone at 8 years old or 9 years old and then try to curtail it when they get to high school. It's much harder to do that.
Right. That kind of brings up, and I guess it's just very, very obvious when we're talking about a topic like this that if we're not careful, we could touch on a parent's idea that we're condemning them or speaking down to them, and we want to be clear we're not. We're just speaking from what is some of the best information that we can find out there, and so let me just give a couple of things that I think we need to keep in mind when we're talking about allowing our kids online. Number one, you have to remember the device the kid has belongs to you. Unless your 8-year-old has a job and is able to drive themselves to the store and sign the contract and leave with that phone belongs to you.
Right.
And so I think we have to remember that. We have to remember who the parent is and who the child is. And again, I say that carefully because that can sure come across sounding wrong.
Sure.
One of the things I learned before I had kids, I was the expert on raising kids. When my kids came, I found out I was a nobody on information about raising kids. And when my kids are grown and now I have grandkids, I am the expert at spoiling grandkids and telling kids they don't know how to raise kids. So we go through cycles, and I want to be careful, but I do think it's extremely important that a parent remembers I'm the owner of that device.
Right.
And therefore I can set the boundaries on that device.
Yeah.
One of the things that I was told early on, and as my children came, by a very godly man, and he told me, he said, I want you to always remember you're their father.
Right.
They'll have friends throughout life. They'll have one dad. And I think that's important for us to remember. We're the parent. And so, I think along those parental controls you were talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's lots of parental tools that we can use. And I think tools is a good way to frame it because if we think about phones, if we project in our homes an image that our phones are our life or our phones are a means to our happiness, right? Like, oh, I'm happy because I'm on Facebook. I'm happy because I'm playing a video game. That might send the wrong message to a kid. Instead, try to send it as this is a tool. This is a means to an end. This is a means to stay connected with people. This is a means to do this or that, but not this is my sole purpose. And so when we're putting together these tools, the number one that I would suggest would be screen time on the iPhone. I mean, when screen time first came out, it was clunky and it wasn't the greatest thing in the whole world, but it's so much more robust now. You can get on there. You can set whether or not your kids can download apps or delete apps. You can put exactly what apps you want on there, and that's it. They can't change them. Right? You can go in there and you can say, my kid can call these people at this time of the day and any other time. It's not going to let them do it. And you control it with a passcode. And it's just a fantastic way if you're using an iPhone. Because look, I get it. We all have an iPhone 4 sitting in the drawer at the house. And when our kid's 11 years old and we're ready to give it to them and give them a phone, we're like, okay, well, they can just use this old iPhone. So I get the temptation of just using that. Now, you could go a step further, which I would even recommend. There's tons of kid-friendly phones out there that are being manufactured every day. You've got Gab phone, you got one called TrueMe, you have Light phone, and those words probably mean nothing to most people, and that's okay. But all of these phones are designed for kids under the age of 15. They come with no social media, very limited or no internet access. They come with companion apps for the parents to use on their phone to control what their kids are doing. They come with GPS. I mean, it's the perfect thing because you're teaching your child how to use a phone as a resource to connect and not as a time pit.
Right. Yeah, and I think you bring out a good point. It's teaching your kids. My daughters had to learn how to drive. Well, I didn't just throw the keys at them one day and say, have at it. Right. I took time and began to teach them to drive. As long before they were able to drive on the highway, I had them driving in the cow pastures and had them learning how to operate that vehicle and had them learning how to be safe on it. As we think about that, one of the things that we know is our kids learn by what we do, not necessarily by what we say.
Yeah.
Right. If I tell my kid, I want you to eat healthy while I'm eating Reese cups, what message is coming across to the kids, right?
To eat Reese cups.
Reese cups are healthy. And so I think you have to begin with yourself.
Yep.
Right? For me to tell my child, you do as I say, not as I do, I think we've learned that's not an effective strategy for parenting. And so I think it's very important. I read one article, and at first, let me just give the disclaimer. When I first read it, I thought, I'm not doing that. But here's what the article said. It said, if you're picking your phone up outside the restrictions that you've placed on your child, explain to them why. And explain to them why your restriction is not applying to that situation, and that this is work. This is something that needs to be done, whatever the case is.
Sure.
And at first I thought, I'm not going to spend all my time explaining to a 10-year-old what I'm doing. But then I think back to why not?
Right.
How else would they learn? And so I think we begin with ourselves, and we begin to model for them what the proper behavior is with the use of those electronics.
I absolutely love that you said that, especially the part about explaining. And, I don't want to paint COVID as a boogeyman, but I just think we have to face the reality that for 2 years, most kids experienced an environment where they were sitting at their table at their house, having class online with a teacher they couldn't connect with, and their parents were there. So there is this disconnect, and there's a little bit of a natural inclination. Sorry, that's what I was looking for. Inclination. There's a natural inclination to kind of go back to me and my device. And that's kind of ingrained in all these kids right now. But when we explain to them, we make this connection, this in-person connection. And I think that's where it all kind of comes from. We should take the time to explain to them. We should take the time to sit with them. And, if your kid's getting involved in social media, why not sit down with them and say, "Wait, what we're looking at today? Like, what's going on?" You don't have to be confrontational with it, but just, hey, let me be a part of your life. Let's connect while we're connecting online. Let's connect in person as well. That'll go a long way with your kids.
Absolutely. And I believe that, again, there's a lot of great stuff out there. And I think that we need to always not, as we used to say, throw the baby out with the bathwater. Okay. But I think as parents, I have watched, you walk into a restaurant and you got mom, dad, and a couple of kids sitting at the table. They all have a phone in their hand and nobody's talking.
Right.
Well, how are we going to know what's happening in that child's life unless I'm texting that kid and getting the story? I don't know what else I'm doing, and they're in front of me, so why am I texting them? And so I think that there is a point in time that the electronics have to be put down.
Sure.
And the parent has to model that. And to sit there and not engage the child and tell them it's okay for me and not you. And so enough said on that. It's my pet peeve, if you will, sure. Is not modeling for our kids because, I tell parents all the time, do not be mad at your child for being you. Okay. And so if they're abusing it and you abuse it, what are we going to do with that? Right. But I think something else, and you mentioned this, and that is setting predictable and enforceable guidelines for what our kids are doing.
Yeah, absolutely. Predictable and enforceable. It's always better to be proactive than reactive. If you say when your kid gets a cell phone, okay, it's your first cell phone. I'm so glad that you have it. This is for you to contact me if you need something, if it's an emergency. This is not for using during your class, right, at school. This is not for dinner time. This is not for whatever. Set those parameters straight off the bat. Kids really like structure. They thrive on it. They absolutely do. You see it constantly in the schools. You have kids that like to push those boundaries, but they only push those boundaries because they're afraid.
Right.
And that's really the truth. They're afraid that there's not a boundary, so they test it to make sure it's still there. And then when they know it's there, they feel safer. They're never going to say that. They're mainly just going to complain. But they do feel safer when there's an established boundary. And I think that goes to everything we do. And if they know, okay, if I do this thing now, if I pick up this phone at dinner like you were talking about, I know I'm going to be disciplined for it because I know I'm not supposed to do it. That is a reassuring thing for them. Kids like predictability. They don't like things thrown on them.
Right. And enforceable, I think, is key. If I'm mad at my child for playing with a phone when they're not supposed to, and I tell them I'm taking that away for 9 months, am I really going to enforce that?
No.
And so we had rules for our girls, and I wouldn't embarrass either one of my girls, but Megan lost her phone off. Oh, I said that out loud, didn't I? Her phone stayed in my pocket more than it stayed in hers, right? But there were enforceable guidelines.
Sure.
And there were very easy rules.
Right.
And I think it's very important that we set that. Now, one of the things, let me just touch, if I may,
sure, please.
Because you mentioned a list of all the social media sites.
Right.
I think one of the most interesting things is right there on their own rules. They say you got to be a minimum of 13 years old to even do this.
Right.
Some of them are older, but yet we have 10-year-olds doing this.
Right.
And I think that comes part of a parent knowing what their kids are doing and where they're at. And I read one that said that your child cannot enter into a social media site until you're their first friend. And so I think enforceable rules.
Yep.
I want to know where you're at and what you're doing. And that's not unreasonable. Here at our church, we have covenant eyes.
Right.
We'll talk more about that, but we have covenant eyes on all the pastors, and we know where each other's at, right? And we can see where each other's been on the web. And so we're not saying do this with your child. We're saying do this with your adult kids. Do this with anyone in your home. Do this with anyone that you want to be accountable with.
Absolutely.
As I said, there's some great things out there on the web and some great information out there. Mm-hmm. But I will tell you, there are some rat holes that we do not want to go down.
Absolutely.
I think you brought up something.
Sure.
And I just want to touch on that just a moment. I may be putting you on a spot that you don't want to be on, but I just want to ask if you can briefly talk to us a little bit, because you mentioned parental controls.
Yep.
All right. Well, my generation, okay, you say parental controls, and we just assume you mean discipline, okay, because that's what parental control was. But when you're talking about that, when it comes to these online devices, can you help us understand a little bit about what you're talking about?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's lots of different ways that you can control a device with parental controls. One of the key things is time. Okay, most kids are in a school environment, especially when they get to middle school, they're issued a standard Chromebook or laptop. That's part of how they do their work now. It's just the world that we live in. So when they get home at the end of the day, they probably don't need to spend 3 hours looking at a screen. It's not good for their eyes. It's not good for their brain. So you can shorten that amount of time. You can set the device to lock out after a certain amount of time. You can set it to allow 30 minutes of social media time. Then it just locks them out. And that's just for the day. And then the next day it restarts for them. So that's one way you can do parental controls. You can control what websites they go to. What is actually probably a smarter way to do it is to just say no websites except for the ones I allow. And then you can go on there because, like you said, there are plenty of really good websites. There's lots of educational websites. There's lots of good Christian websites for kids that we would want to encourage them to be on. But I think the key with these parental controls is with the driving force behind why a kid wants anything on their phone, I'm just going to say it, is FOMO. It's a fear of missing out. What's going to happen with Joe, Sally, and Bob at school that I'm not going to see if I don't get on Snapchat and check tonight? What in their life is going to blow their world up? And a lot of times that's what it is. You know, we think about things blowing our world up as like the air conditioner going out or something like that. But for them, when Sally and Joe break up, that's a big deal for kids and for youth and teenagers. And so we need to be aware of that, and we need to be conscious of that. But we also need to just say, this is the amount of time that I feel like is healthy. And at the end of the day, you got to just be the parent and not the friend. At the end of the day, I say this is how it is, this is how it is.
Right. And I think that's a great advice to parents. And as we've said, that the internet's not all bad. And I think for the parents listening, maybe the grandparents that would have part of this, if you don't know how to do this, I'm assuming you could just, as we would say, Google it. You can just jump up online and you can just put in a search how to put parental controls on a phone or whatever, and be able to come up with some of those answers. You know, when we think about that, we think about internet safety. There's not many weeks go by that we don't read about an internet predator. And we don't read about some really sad or horrific or near miss, if you will, from a child being abducted or being assaulted because of an internet connection, because of something like that. So how do we teach our children about internet predators? How do we teach our children how to be safe in that realm of the freedom? Because look, you got to let them grow up at some point.
Right.
And so I agree with the parental controls 100%. But at some point in time, you got to start loosening the reins a little bit.
Absolutely.
Or they become a robot and not a functioning adult in society. All right. And so how do we begin to teach them to know where those parameters are and to know where those dangers are?
Yeah, great question. I want to be careful here how I word this, because I realize that we live in a world where online friends can be real, true, genuine friends. That's a true thing. You know, I've got people in my life that are friends that I've met before, obviously, but that I communicate mainly through my phone with, that don't live here. And I know that there are people that are a little younger than me or maybe a little older than me that maybe have genuine friendships that were cultivated online and in games or things like that. But an 11-year-old or a 9-year-old, they don't need online friends. And, I hope that doesn't step on anybody's toes, but that's just how I feel. I don't think they need online friends because at that point, we mentioned that, your brain's not fully formed until 25. It's hard to make the distinction of, is this safe or is this predatory? So whenever they're going and trying to make these online friends or they're trying to make online connections with people, a good general rule of thumb is if you don't know them in real life, you don't know them on your phone.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think it goes back to also what you said about restricting the time, the apps that they can download. And let's just go full disclosure, right? This is not just for kids. Pastor Quin and I are in an accountability to where we control the apps that are on each other's phone. So we're not talking about kids do this. I mean, adults do this because there's a lot of really cool apps for me out there, and there's a lot of apps out there that I don't need on my phone. Right. And you're my accountability partner to make sure that they don't wind up on my phone. And so parents, when we're talking about this, we're not saying this is something for kids. And so we want to make sure anybody listening to this needs to be, because I will tell you, not a day goes by. I really don't believe a day goes by that I do not get a bogus friend request on one of the social media accounts.
Yep.
And I'm like, okay, I'm already friends with this person. Why am I getting another one? Yep. And then you find out that it's just a bogus. And so, but our kids, unfortunately, are not always thinking that way. Because most of our adults don't think that way. All right.
We talked about how kids liked having boundaries and parameters. Well, the truth is you don't really grow out of that.
Right.
Everybody likes structure, even the ones that fight against it. We like to know where our box is. And we want a big box, but we like to know that we have one.
Yeah. And I think as parents, and I really want to add this again, I said it a moment ago, don't put your kids in internet jail. Okay. I think if you do that, there's no training structure to that.
Sure.
But teach and instruct your kids as to the benefits of what they're dealing with here, but also the dangers of. Again, let's go back to driving a vehicle. I taught my kids the benefit of, somehow or another, they think I'm so old I rode horses. And so, but you know what? I taught them the benefit of that vehicle getting us where we wanted to be, but I also helped them understand that if you're not careful, you don't arrive to where you want to be.
That's right.
And I think teaching our kids, hey, you know what, this internet has got a lot of great information, and it's great. Like you said, we live in a global society.
Yeah.
I have friends that I have worked with through mission trips and through seminary and college that live all over the world, literally all over the world. And you take the internet out, and I would know nothing about what's happening with them in their world or what's going on. We have people that tag in to both our podcast. We have people that tag in to our live feed on Sunday morning from multiple places in the world. All right. So there's some really positives.
Absolutely.
But there's some negatives. Yeah. And we want to train and be careful of that.
Yep. And it's just all about protecting yourself and your kids. I mean, honestly, we've all been in a place where we know we shouldn't click on something and we click on it anyways. And if we, who are fully formed, our brain's fully functional, and we've had experience and we know we shouldn't do it, if we fall into that trap sometimes, how much bigger is that snare for our kiddos?
And I think one of the things that people in general fail to remember, internet search does not go away. Okay.
Even if you hit the button,
even if you hit delete, it does not go away. And we read about that as well, where somebody's sitting in court and they're bringing up deleted messages, and you're like, well, how do they have a deleted message? Because it doesn't go away.
That's right.
And to help our kids understand that. And we're in a society today. I talk to people that I have contact with that employ a lot of people, even as we're hiring a staff pastor here. One of the things we do is, we go back and do 3 to 5 year deep dives into their internet history, into their social media, into where they've been, what they've been doing. And I think helping our kids understand that, you know what, this stuff you're posting that you think is funny, will not be. Earlier this year, before football season began, I won't go into all the particulars, but there was a student that received a full scholarship to a major university. But yet they found something on his social media that they said does not reflect the values of our university, and they pulled his full scholarship. I think parents need to make sure that their children are aware that what's funny is not necessarily funny.
Well, the way that my mom put it to me is, if you don't want your grandma seeing that, you better not put it on Facebook.
Well, that eliminates a lot.
And my grandma had a fly swatter, so I made sure. But just to kind of go on that, I really do think it's an unprecedented time that we kind of have going on right now, because I want you to just reflect. If everything that you thought or said as a 20-something-year-old or an 18-year-old, if every one of those was recorded down in a book, would you want people reading it? And for most of us, the answer is no. And for us that are a little older, we don't have to worry about that because no one was taking pictures of us doing stupid things in college. But now it's a real thing we have to worry about. So you just have to be ultra vigilant to protect yourself, because it can really impact your life.
Yeah, if the internet existed and Snapchat and Facebook and all the other social medias when I was 14, I probably wouldn't be sitting here today. I mean, seriously, that's a great point. I mean, these kids need to remember that their life is being documented and not always in a positive light.
That's right.
And one mistake can follow you, minus the picture, but boy, you put the picture with it and the internet story with it, and there you go. That's a great point.
Yeah.
Let me just kind of move toward a wrap up.
Sure. Yeah.
And let me just hit some things we've talked about.
Yep.
And we'll just kind of summarize some of this. One of the things we mentioned is internet filtering and things that are available there. And just wanted to make sure if I understood you correctly, you were in favor of that. You were
absolutely.
Okay.
And for those looking for more resources, covenanteyes.com is one of the best out there. Focus on the Family has some great resources for kids specifically. And then if you have an iPhone, and I encourage adults to do this as well as kids, because like we said, it's for adults too. I would encourage you to get on Apple's website, go to their screen time, and figure out how you can put limits on yourself, just to keep yourself off your phone and more engaged.
Right. And that's a great point. And I'm glad you brought that back out, because I know we're talking about internet safety for kids, but I just can't emphasize enough, all of us need to be safe. The parental controls, again, we've touched base on that, man. Just jump up on Google and it can tell you how to do it. And, and quite honestly, ask your 9-year-old, they know how to do it. And so that's one direction. I think once we talk about the importance of these internet monitoring sites, these blocking sites, but I can't emphasize enough to parents, you got to model that. Yeah. And so if I'm going to lock my child's phone down, and again, I'm realize this is a teaching tool, and they don't need everything, but I think explaining to them what I'm doing, why I'm doing it, helping them understand. This is how you gain responsibility. As you follow the rules here, then we will know that you're mature enough to take the next set of rules. Right. And I think that's important. And we talked about, right, how important that is.
Absolutely it is,
Yeah. And one of the things that I hear is, what about my child's privacy? And are they not entitled to privacy? And I will just say, I'm not the one you want to ask that question to. So, and I know, I guess I'm old school, but you live in my house, you eat my food, you warm in my heat, you follow my rules.
Sure. And I would never want to compare a child to a dog by any means, but I would like to just ask the question: if you take a dog to the park with 20 other dogs, are you going to take it off its leash? I mean, you wouldn't, because it could get hurt.
Right.
And that's all it is. It's we tend to, and I think society, our culture right now kind of tells us that limiting our kids is a bad thing, but it's an act of love.
Right. You know, my grandkids, literally, they know more about how to navigate the web than I do, and I'm on it all the time for for work and things like that, and really important stuff like where the fish are biting and that kind of stuff. And so when you think about that, I think it's important, and we've touched on it a little bit, but don't turn your child loose sit with your child.
Yeah.
Let them show you what they're interested in. Let them. My granddaughters will show me what they're interested in, and things of that nature. And I think that's important that you sit with, you spend time with, you talk to with them on that. And I just think that if we fail to do that, then we're really missing a great opportunity to invest in our kids. I just think one of the other things is help your kids know what to do if they stumble into a site that they shouldn't be at.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. And have a little bit of grace. Just a little bit of grace.
Right.
It goes a long way. Kids are just terrified of disappointing their parents and their teachers. They're terrified of it. They don't want to do it. But if you show them some grace and say, you know what, you made a mistake. Here's how we're not going to make it again.
Right.
That's all it is.
Great point. And I think the failure to do that is what will force them to hide the mistake rather than talk to you about the mistake.
Right. And we all know when mistakes get hidden, then they just magnify until they can't be fixed.
And so I think that is extremely important. I think one of the things as we teach them what to do as they stumble into, I think that's teaching them some basics. For instance, parents, listen, if you've not done this, make sure that your child knows they don't give their name out online for any reason. They don't give their address out for any reason, nor anyone else's address. They don't carry on a conversation with a stranger, and they absolutely do not send a picture, an appropriate picture, nor an inappropriate picture for sure. To someone they know or don't know.
Right.
And I think, again, we have to remember, and I love the way one article I read, it said, teach your children this way. Do you want the picture that you're about to send to be seen 10 years from now?
Right. Because
there's a real chance it will be.
Absolutely.
And so I think it's really important that we understand what that looks like. You know, it's simply tracking your digital footprint. All right. So when I'm talking about a digital footprint, and again, this goes back to the importance of the screen time, the internet sites, the Covenant Eyes that we use here at our church, and again, the others, Focus on the Family, and others are great options there. They can't delete internet history. Right. We go to our Covenant systems and we can think we deleted internet history, but there's a track of that history that's maintained. And I think helping them understand that digital footprint, there's some great things, and I don't know if our parents are aware of that, but you know what, if I'm going to give my child a cell phone, I'm going to make sure that something along the lines of 360 or some networking app is on that phone to where I know where that child is and I know where they're at. For our children that are with our cell phones and they're beginning to learn how to drive, there are apps that will lock that phone down and not allow it to be used when that car is in motion. Right. All right. And parents, if you're using that cell phone while you're driving, telling your kid not to, that's not good. That's not going to help. And so I think we have to begin to teach. And instruct the positive. Let's go back to that. Man, there are some really great tools out there, and we want our kids to learn how to use those correctly.
Absolutely. But you talked about teaching your daughters to drive. You didn't put them in the car and not tell them what the gear shift did you? And you wouldn't put them in the car and not show them the brake and the clutch, because I know you probably had clutches back then. In those
easy
days.
now.
But you wouldn't, you would show them all the parts of the car. Right. So when we give them a phone, why are we not getting on there and saying, okay, well, here's the internet. Here's the things on the internet. Here are the tabs. Here's the search history. And if you really want to be vulnerable and you really want to check your own self, show them your search history. Right. What better way to show them this is how this works? And when they see that trust coming from you, they're going to be more willing to give it back.
Well, isn't that exactly what Paul wrote when he said, train your children? And I think I think there's so many positives that we can do with that.
Sure.
And by training, it's the same as Deuteronomy tells us that we're to keep Scripture before our kids. We're to keep God's truth before our kids. And again, internet devotions and things. There's a lot of great ways to do that. Let me give just a couple of things that I want us to be mindful of. One of the things that I did find just for us to be focusing on is 85% of Americans say that they're online at least once a day. Mm-hmm. Okay. It was over 60% that said that they're on the phone or online in a manner that they would call consistently online. Wow. Tells me at some point in time, you're taking something away from your employer if you're spending all your time online at work. And that probably didn't land well with some people, but still the truth, right? And so how do we help with that? There is a webpage, and we're going to try to get this in the notes for you to see if you're listening to this podcast, but it's called Net's Smart Kids. Nets, Nets, or Net Smart, MSMARTZ, kids, netsmartkids.org. And in there's some videos and some things kid-friendly that will help them begin to know why it's important. And there's some good stuff there on some hard-hitting safety issues. And so that's good. Again, we've already talked about the different blocking software, the locking them down. I just think finally, pray for your kids. And if you're not praying for them, then I would argue all the instruction in the world is not going to accomplish what you want it to do.
That's right. You know, as we kind of wind down here, I just encourage everybody to think that everybody who is a child of God is on a mission. Mm-hmm. And if you're a parent, your mission field is your children.
Exactly.
That is your mission field. And so what better use of your time could you possibly do than pouring every bit that you have into training them, to teaching them, to keeping them safe, and helping them make a disciple?
You know, it's keeping the lines of communication open.
Absolutely.
And one of the things that we know, sometimes those lines of communication can get blocked. Mm-hmm. And sometimes if those lines of communication get blocked, you need an outside source, somebody to step in and help you work through those. Next week, Pastor Joey, who is doing an in-depth study of biblical counseling, and Pastor Alex, who is in seminary now for a counseling degree, will be on the podcast next week talking about biblical, Christ-centered counseling. Yeah. And you know what? If we're not careful, we get our advice off the internet, or we can get our advice out of Scripture.
Right.
And so I encourage everyone to join us next week as Pastor Alex and Pastor Joey will discuss how to make sure Christ-centered counseling is at the center of what you're doing.
Absolutely.
And so we'll just wrap it up saying navigating this delicate balance of keeping our kids where they need to be is so important for us.
Absolutely.
And so the reality is, parents, you have a responsibility.
That's right. Thanks for joining us today.